Wayne Wang, thank you very much for joining us here today on WKCR.
Happy to be there.
Okay.
Be on the phone.
Yeah. Hopefully you can hear us okay, and our listeners can hear us okay. You have 2 movies coming out next month.
Yeah.
Tell me their titles and the synopsises.
Well, the first one is called 1,000 Years of Good Prayers. The second one is called Princess of Nebraska. They're both short stories from a collection of stories by Yiyun Li that came out a couple of years ago. The first one, 1,000 Years, is a story about a father from Beijing who comes over to visit his daughter who's been living here and just got a divorce. And he's very concerned about her, and he's trying to find out what's going on with her life. And through this, visit, a lot of the past comes up between them. The second one, Princess of Nebraska, is about a student from China who is only 19, and she just started, going to the University of Nebraska, and she finds out she's pregnant, and she goes to San Francisco to figure out what she wants to do with the baby. Between these 2 movies, actually, there is, 3 generations of Chinese from China. One who really directly went through the Cultural Revolution. The daughter in the first one actually was very much affected as a child growing up, with some of the things that happened with her father. And the third one, which is from the new economic boom period of China, has probably very little sense of history and what the Cultural Revolution really was. So, and all these are characters now in the U.S. and, how they're dealing with their lives here. So that's basically, what the 2 films are, and they're thematically linked that way.
Uh-huh. The movie which I had a chance to see, 1,000 Years of Good Prayer, I'd really like to focus on that. Can you tell me what you found so fascinating and so interesting about the characters in this short story that you chose to direct it for the big screen?
One, I've been wanting to do something about the Cultural Revolution, but maybe more the after effects on someone rather than directly the Cultural Revolution. So in this case, it was sort of a perfect character with Mr. Xi, the father, who went through a lot of persecutions during the Cultural Revolution, rightly or wrongly. And, now he says, it's enough to survive it, and I just want to go on with it. And he comes to America to visit his daughter. The daughter, meanwhile, is very similar to me. I mean, she comes to America, I think 10 years ago or something, learns a new language, learns a new culture, and becomes a new person, so to speak, with being, more American. And now the father comes over, and, they have to figure out how they communicate and get along, actually. So I myself is from Hong Kong with very traditional parents, and and I came to America and I learned a new language and new culture and became kind of a new person. And I remember the first time my father came over, and it was very similar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you don't mind me asking you a little bit about your personal life, so you came to America first, and then your family came later?
Yes, I was sent over to go to college first. So I was here for, almost 10 years before they came over. Or actually, the first time my father came over, he came over to visit because I got married, and I didn't tell my parents I got married because, it was a very private thing, that it's a commitment between me and my wife, and I didn't really, tell them. And then he found out through the gossip magazines, and he flew over thinking something is wrong. So, and then by that time I had become, a different person. I've grown up. I'm more American, and there were, a lot of conflict and a lot of stress, and which are all things that sort of are in this movie too.
Yeah, obviously there are a lot of parallels. So I mean, from the shorts, how much of the story in these characters is from the short story, and how much of it is from your own personal life?
A lot of it is from the short story. I never try to put too much of my personal life into a movie. I just try to identify things that I that are similar to my own experiences and try to make it resonate that way. So these two characters are not me. The daughter is not really me, but I could identify with a lot of the things that she's going through. They're not really biographical, but there's a lot of resonance to my own life.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the hardship of the Cultural Revolution. The father in this movie is a staunch communist, or at least a believer in the Communist Party.
Right.
Is this a parallel to your own experiences, and like how many people of this generation have the same feelings and beliefs that Mr. Shi does?
Well, I don't know if I could talk about how many, but a lot of people went through a lot of tragedies during the Cultural Revolution, and I've heard a lot of stories about it. Actually, there's a new book that's reviewed in the New York Times today that really covers quite a bit of it by a guy that was reviewed today, and I think what happened was, like Mr. Shi, he was probably, involved with a young woman in some way at work, and oftentimes, that is used as a way of persecution, of saying that you are a bourgeois, intellectual or something, and they'll find a way to kind of, persecute you and put you in prison, and a lot of people went through that, and as far as I know, many people didn't survive it. Many of them actually died in prison or were executed or whatnot. So these stories are pretty prevalent. I can't put a number to them, but it's pretty common.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In the film, the characters speak in both Chinese and in English, and there's even a little bit of Farsi. Later on, Mr. Shi develops this relationship with this woman, Madame, who doesn't speak English well. He doesn't speak English well. How did you approach language in this film, and what were you trying to say?
Well, I'm very interested, first of all, in the idea that I was talking about earlier, where English is a more expressive language, than the Chinese language. That's between the father and the daughter. Two, I also find that language, sometimes the music of language and the emotion of the language, actually you can communicate quite well without knowing the specifics of the language. So in the case of the Iranian woman and the father on the park bench, neither of them speak English very well. Sometimes, as you said, they speak Farsi and he speaks Chinese, but they communicate quite well. And I also didn't subtitle some of those things because I wanted the audience to also experience the music and the emotion of the language, and they will realize very quickly that actually they get it. I think that's one thing that I was really trying to talk about, is that first of all, their language are quite different, whether it's Chinese or English or some other language, and some are more expressive than others, and that there is an emotionality and music to it that if you listen carefully, you can understand a lot of it without knowing the specifics.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that English is more expressive than Chinese. Can you tell me how that comes to play in the film?
At moments when the daughter finally argues with her father, she switches into English because she's almost more comfortable and it's easier for her to express her frustration and her anger, so to speak. So in a way, I think, and then sometimes she goes back to her Chinese, but in a way, from my own experience knowing the two languages, Mandarin especially is a very formal language. It's an older language. It's oftentimes spoken in kind of phrases that are like proverbs. And English is much more expressive. And the daughter actually, switches to something that's much more expressive when she's arguing with her father. And you can also see her sometimes when she's talking on the phone with her boyfriend who is not Chinese, and she's much more expressive and much more open in a way with that, with how she is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
language is a pet interest of mine. I mean, I had to learn English more after I came here, and I also taught English as a second language, and I'm very fascinated by it and how it becomes more expressive for oneself, especially comparing English to Chinese. When I first got married with my wife, when we argue, I would automatically switch to English because I could express my emotions better, and she would always accuse me of, why are you speaking in English? Are you trying to, do something to kind of avoid this thing? I said, I'm not. It's more easier for me to talk about it this way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I find that very fascinating.
Hello?
Yep. If I can switch tracks here just for a second. You've done very famously. You've directed the movie Smoke, which was an independent hit. And you've also done larger Hollywood movies like Made in Manhattan with Jennifer Lopez. I'm just wondering, as a director, how do you find, what's the difference between working with, let's say, this huge diva like Jennifer Lopez or a smaller, less known actor?
Well, first of all, every actor is completely different, whether they're professional, well-known, or less well-known, or whatever. Every actor have their own personality and their own quirks. With somebody like Jennifer Lopez, she was very professional, very well prepared, and she's very talented, and she could give me a lot of choices. In Thousand Years, actually, the two main actors were both very well-trained actors and have a lot of experience. The only thing I may say is that because they're trained, in the Chinese way, they tend to be a little bit more dramatic, which I had to kind of tell them to kind of tone down. Mm-hmm. But they're very professional actors, and they could kind of give me a lot too. But there's also a lot of non-professional actors in that movie because it's an independent movie, and we didn't have the money to hire a lot of professional actors. And that with the non-professionals, you really have to cast them right and let them be the character rather than tell them to act, because they can't really act somebody else. So those are kind of the differences that I can kind of talk about. But ultimately, like, everyone and every actor is different, and you have to just deal with that particular person.
Something which you said, which is very interesting, which kind of links back to what we were speaking about before, is that you said that Chinese actors are more dramatic, and you also said that English is more of an expressive language. Do you think there's any linkage between the fact that the Chinese acting style is more melodramatic and the language?
I'm not sure about that. Maybe there's a link because Chinese acting is usually trained for the stage, mm-hmm. and stage acting is more dramatic. Mm-hmm. So they're not very trained for film acting, which has to be more subtle. And then on top of that, if they have to speak English, then they tend to be more dramatic because it's not their first language. It tends to be, and the expressiveness of it kind of all, pushes it even more. That's the connection I can make from it. But going back to your question is it's more the fact that the Chinese are trained in a theater context more, and that's why they're more dramatic.
This movie, A Thousand Years of Good Hope, it's going to be released on August 15th in New York, and then later...
I think it's going to be pushed back a little bit to September right now.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, either way, it's gonna be released in America either August or September.
Right.
Do you have any plans to release it or screen it in China? And if so, how do you think the reactions will be different than that of American audiences?
I think the Chinese audience actually would be quite interested in the movie and would respond, very positively to the movie and be very moved by it, and also get a glimpse of their own people, in the context of America too. The problem we might have is that there's a censorship issue with the Chinese government, because originally the film was supposed to be co-financed by China, and then there were some things that they were unhappy about. For example, the line where the father says, communism is not bad, it just fell into wrong hands. Mm-hmm. So, they wanted to take those things out. So, sadly, the film will probably be banned in China and probably just go underground on illegal DVDs. But I think for the ordinary people, they will see it and they can really enjoy it and sympathize with it and feel very, very connected to the movie.
Because we hit upon the topic, can you tell me about if you've had any experiences with communist censorship with your films in the past?
With this film?
No, with any films you've done in the past. Have you ever run into any issues?
Well, not directly myself. When we did the Joy Luck Club, they had to go through the script very carefully and have to approve everything. And Joy Luck Club is pretty non-political, so that was all, okay. There were subsequent scripts where I have submitted, and they have, not been that positive about them and wanted changes, and including A Thousand Years of Good Prayers. There was another one that was actually a ghost story, and they said they don't want to promote, superstition and things like that. There was other scripts where there were gangster elements in it, and they said we don't want to show that. So they're very, very sensitive about different things. You never know what they might get sensitive about. For example, Mission Impossible was shot in Shanghai, and there was, in the background in one of the fast action scenes, there were some windows, and there were dirty laundry hanging there, or actually clean laundry hanging out to dry, and they were unhappy about that, and I think Paramount eventually had to CGI some of it out. So they're pretty sensitive about things. But yet at the same time, if I look at America, one of the things that's interesting is, the ratings board here, if you have a character smoke a cigarette in a movie now, it's automatically an R rating. So that's a different kind of censorship. I know smoking is bad for you and all that, but still, it's another way of censoring things. So.
Very, very interesting. Has A Thousand Years of Good Hope been rated, and are you going to submit it for rating?
You mean for the U.S.?
For the United States, yeah.
I don't think we are, because I don't think we have to go through that system. But 1,000 Years here, should be okay. I'm just trying to think if anybody smokes a cigarette in the movie.
A Thousand Years of Good Prayer. Director Wayne Wang, thank you so much for joining us here on WKCR.
Well, thank you.